It's taken me a little bit to gather my thoughts because philosophy isn't really my thing. But I am finally, I think, ready to talk about the unbearable lightness of being in a little bit more depth than just a little short telling you all to read this. So let's jump into this classic. Hello, book friends. It's Alyssa. Welcome back to the channel. Hello, if you are new. We're going to try our best to talk about the unbearable lightness of being, to whet your appetite for this wonderful classic, and explain to you why you kind of need to read this now more than ever. I don't know. Just read it. That's the end of the video. No. So I kind of broke this into a couple parts. So I have some notes here on this side, but I'm going to link a couple other reviews down below that I think are phenomenal, and we'll talk about this in ways that I just don't think that I have the language for, because I'm not a big philosophy reader and I don't have that knowledge bank to draw on. I can just tell you that this is a book that I read when I was in college and absolutely adored. I read it again, I think in my like early 30s, and now I'm in my 40s and I'm reading it again, and I still really love this book. I'm also not going to go into too much depth about the author, Milan Kundera. He has a very interesting life. He's a Czech author, but I think he more identifies as French. He did leave Czechoslovakia and moved to France and stopped writing in his native Czech and started writing in French, I believe. But this came out, this is as old as I am. This came out in 1983, and I think it was translated in 1984, something like that. And it is many people's favorite novel, a favorite novel of theirs, a life-changing novel, a memorable novel. Pick like one of the novels that made you kind of books. And I think it's because every time you read this, you come to it with a new perspective from a different area of your life, like a different part in your life, and you can keep picking up new things. I just think there's a lot in here, and it's a very interesting read. It's a very philosophical read, like I said, and I think that you can get a lot out of it. That was a lot of rambling. Let's kind of stick to some notes. I tried to make this organized because otherwise it's just gonna be me gushing about like existential fiction and this particular novel for who knows how long, and then I don't know if it's gonna make any sense. So I figured we'd start by talking about just generally what the Prague Spring is, and because that is the backdrop of this novel, and then a bit of the philosophy within the unbearable lightness of being. Again, I'm not gonna go really hard here because I don't know enough, but just to give you a little breadcrumbs. So if you want to go down some rabbit holes and find out more, if you want to watch the videos that I've linked below for even more information, go for it. I think you will learn a lot. But I'm just here to get you started, and then I'm going to talk a bit about the story itself, the way the narrative the narrative is set up, and then give you some of my thoughts, and that should be the general outline of this video. So let's start with what the heck is the Prague Spring. So I wanted to start with this quote from page, I think it's 176. So it's 176 in my edition, and it is, "Anyone who thinks that the communist regimes of Central Europe are exclusively the work of criminals is overlooking a basic truth. The criminal regimes were made not by criminals, but by enthusiasts, convinced that they had discovered the only road to paradise. They defended the road so valiantly that they were forced to execute many people. Later it became clear that there was no paradise, that the enthusiasts were therefore murderers. Then everyone took to shouting at the communists, 'You are the ones responsible for our country's misfortunes.' It had grown poor and desolate. For its loss of independence, it had fallen into the hands of the Russians for its judicial murders. And the accused responded, 'We didn't know. We were deceived. We were true believers. Deep in our hearts, we were innocent.' In the end, the dispute narrowed down to a single question. Did they really know, or were they merely making believe?" So we are in Prague. It is 1968. It is the Prague Spring. What is the Prague Spring? It's a period of political liberalization and reforms that happened in Czechoslovakia that lasted from January to August of 1968. It was led by Alexander Dubček. I Here we go. Dubček. The reform movement aimed to create socialism with a human face and introduced greater freedom of speech, media, travel, while it also decentralized the economy. But the Soviet Union really didn't like this. It was seen as a threat by the Soviet Union and the rest of like the Warsaw Pact countries. And on August 20th to 21st in 1968, approximately 500,000 troops from the 5 Warsaw Pact countries invaded Czechoslovakia and ended effectively the Prague Spring and reinstated like very strict communist control. I think the Hey Jude scene in the movie version of The Unbearable Lightness of Being does a really great job of capturing what that moment is like, that invasion. And this plays a large role in the decisions that our characters make in this story. So this pivotal moment and like Czech history really is the center of the plot of this novel, if this novel even has a plot, and really is the thing that forces our characters to make decisions. That is the catalyst, but the thought process behind those decisions plays into the philosophy that Kundera is trying to look at in this novel. So let's talk a little bit about that philosophy. And I'm going to start with sort of the opening pages here. I think he lays things out really clearly right at the beginning of the novel. This is chapter 1, page 1. The idea of the eternal return is a mysterious one, and Nietzsche has often perplexed other philosophers with it. To think that everything reoccurs as we once experienced it, that the reoccurrence itself reoccurs ad infinitum, what does this mad myth signify? Putting it negatively, the myth of eternal return states that a life which disappears once and for all, which does not return, is like a shadow without weight, dead in advance. And whether it was horrible, beautiful, or sublime, its horror, sublimity, and beauty mean nothing. We need to take no more note of it than of a war between 2 African kingdoms in the 14th century, a war that altered nothing in the destiny of the world. Even if 100,000 blacks perished in excruciating torment, will the war between 2 African kingdoms in the 14th century itself be altered if it reoccurs again and again in eternal return? It will. It will become a solid mass, permanently protuberant, its inanity irreparable. If the French Revolution were to reoccur eternally, French historians would be less proud of Robespierre. But because they deal with something that will not return, the bloody years of the Revolution have turned into mere words, theories, and discussions, have become lighter than feathers, frightening no one. There is an infinite difference between a Robespierre who occurs only once in history and a Robespierre who eternally returns, chopping off French heads. Let us therefore agree that the idea of eternal return implies a perspective from which things appear other than they as we know them. They appear without the mitigating circumstances of their transitory nature. This mitigating circumstance prevents us from coming to a verdict, for how can we condemn something that is ephemeral in transit? In the sunset of dissolution, everything is illuminated by the aura of nostalgia, even the guillotine. So the basis of the philosophy within The Unbearable Lightness of Being is really this idea of Nietzsche's of the eternal return, and the opposite of that, this idea of lightness. It's a lot of the lightness of being, the heaviness of existence, and that dichotomy, that push and pull, that paradox is the underlying theme of this entire novel. So just to give a little bit, I pulled up a little brief description of what the concept of eternal return is. And I don't know how exacting this is. If you want to go down a philosophy rabbit hole, please do. This concept suggests that the universe and all existence reoccurs infinitely. According to this idea, we are destined to repeat the same life with all the joys and sorrows exactly as we lived it before for eternity. This creates an immense weight or heaviness to every decision or moment, as it will be repeated forever. However, there's this idea of lightness that emerges if you don't have this eternal return. If things happen only once and never again, they lack weight and consequence. And this creates a paradox. While this lightness might seem liberating, our mistakes won't be repeated forever. It can also make us feel meaningless or insubstantial, and each moment disappears into a nothingness, never to return. And so this tension between these two ideas forms, like I said, the basis of this narrative. It is the major theme throughout these narratives, and it becomes how like our characters are split, decisions are split. It really feeds the whole plot of the novel. And I think it's a big reason why when I read this in college, it was such a impactful novel, because these are the kinds of things you start thinking about when you start entering into your adult life. Like, what is the meaning of all of this? Does any of it have a point? So this fits really nicely into that moment in your life where you're starting to ask those big questions. The novel examines this whole idea of lightness and heaviness through the idea that every moment occurs only once and never returns. That is a big, big point. Kundera doesn't have like this idea of like cyclicalness or reincarnation or anything like that. It is very much you live one life and that's it. So does it matter if we do anything? What does it matter what we choose? There's a lot of questions that come up as you're going through that. But he also has a few other concepts that we talk about. There's this Inmal East Keinmal, which he talks about, which is once is and never. I think I have a nice little quote on that. So our main character, Tomasz, says this to himself. Einmal ist keinmal. I think I said that wrong. Sorry, German speakers. What happens but once, says the German adage, might as well not have happened at all. If we all have only one life to live, we might as well not have lived at all. So you have that whole idea that a life which occurs only once might as well have not occurred at all. So there's no weight to judge it against. So what do your choices kind of matter? There's a dichotomy between the soul and the body. I mean, Tomasz really embodies this with a lot of his struggles between his like physical desires and different emotional attachments he may or may not have with the people in his life. There's a really interesting breakdown of this idea of kitsch, which Sabina goes through, and it's this idea, it's defined as like the denial of everything unacceptable in human existence and the desire to create an artificially beautiful world devoid of complexity. And they have this really great exchange that I'm not going to go through here, but there's this really beautiful exchange between Sabina and Tomasz that I really enjoyed. So I encourage you to read this so you can see some of these really great exchanges between our characters. There's a lot of batting back and forth philosophical ideas between our characters, or just our characters in their own like internal, external conversations. It's interesting. There's also this burden of choice that he looks at a lot that goes into the what do we choose to do? Do our decisions have consequences? Does it matter that our decisions have consequences? They're constantly grappling, the characters, with these decisions and the consequences they can't see. And it sort of highlights the existential weight of human agency. You know, we have this free will, but what does it matter that we have this free will? We don't know the consequences of our actions until we do those things. And it's not like we can go back and change anything. Once started, we're just on this path towards death, basically. And all of our choices are just whatever we choose along that path. And, you know, we're not coming back to repeat anything. So how do we know what was the best choice and what was not? So throughout this novel, these philosophical concepts are not merely abstract ideas, but they're like deeply woven into our characters' lives and their choices. We'll see it with like Tomasz's womanizing, with Teresa's jealousy, with Sabina's rejection of sort of everything, any kind of tie to anything at all, emotional, physical. She is a very free spirit. And then Franz's idealism are all sort of different responses to lightness and heaviness and the like struggles of existence. And I think what I really like is that the novel doesn't really suggest that there is a clear answer to whether lightness or heaviness is preferable. Instead, it presents this paradox as fundamental to like the human condition, and that we are simultaneously burdened by our choices and haunted by the consequences of those choices. So we're constantly shifting between weightness and heaviness, dark and light, good and bad. We're like always shifting on this spectrum. And at the end of the day, does any of it really matter? Because we can't go back and change anything. I think that if you are a philosophy like buff, you could go really deep here. But for somebody who is not a philosophy buff, it's still really approachable, and you're going to pick up and relate to a lot of the concepts and ideas that Kundera is spelling out in the story and the plot. So the story itself is interesting. We have 4 characters. You've already been introduced to them briefly: Tomasz, Teresa, Sabina, and Franz. Everybody is a Czech except for, I think, Franz is Swiss, if I remember correctly. I know that we don't see him till we get to Switzerland. But they all sort of represent different facets of heaviness and lightness. And there is some shifting that also occurs in characters as they develop through the novel from like one spectrum to one side of the spectrum to the other, which is really nice to see. We see them before the Soviet invasion. Then the Soviet invasion is our catalyst that sets our four characters off into different directions. Then we see how their lives all play out. And it's interesting to watch from sort of not the beginning of their lives, but from a moment, and we're starting that as the starting point of meeting all these characters until their end and seeing how they shift and change, but also remembering this idea that like it all kind of doesn't matter. It's interesting to grapple with in your head. And also Kundera like self-inserts a lot as the author of this story. He basically tells you from the beginning that he's using all four of these characters as devices to explore this idea of lightness and heaviness, that they're not just necessarily like real people. It's not that kind of story. It's like they are his little pawns and little experiments, and he's pushing them through life to show you what he wants you to understand of this philosophy, this idea. So you get these moments that are really interesting where he self-inserts and talks to you. And I really liked this one. He says, the characters in my novel, this is page 221. The characters in my novels are my own unrealized possibilities. That is why I am equally fond of them all and equally horrified by them. Each one has crossed a border that I myself have circumvented. It is that cross border, the border beyond which my own I ends, which attracts me most. Far beyond that border begins the secret the novel asks about. The novel is not the author's confession. It is an investigation of human life in the trap the world has become. But enough, let us return to Tomasz. So I do enjoy that piece, that you get this pulling back away from our characters to remember that these are all just devices that Kundera is using to push his philosophical agenda in many ways. But anyway, it primarily follows our four characters. We start in Czechoslovakia in the late 60s and we go into the early 70s. Tomáš is a successful surgeon and he's a committed womanizer. Like he's not having sex to like be lecherous. It's like there's this separation between emotion and bodily needs. He kind of wants to know as many women as possible and he learns them through sexual acts, but he doesn't want to have emotional connections with them. I think that the movie Daniel Day-Lewis plays him very lecherous and he doesn't feel very lecherous in the book. It's just kind of straightforward. It's I like to have sex with women, and he has sex with women, and he has these boundaries that he sticks to, and it's not emotional, and he is fairly honest with all of them, and he's not like manipulative. So he lives by this model of lightness and pursuing a sexual relationship while avoiding emotional attachments. That is his goal: sexual relationships over emotional attachments at all costs. But his life changes when he meets and falls in love with Teresa. She's the waitress. He sees her and she just like shows up on his doorstep back in Prague and kind of never leaves. And she pulls him from like lightness to heaviness. She pulls him from, just frivolous relationships with women to actually the heaviness of having an emotional connection with another human being. Tomáš was also like previously married. He had a very bad divorce. He doesn't really talk to his son. He's got some baggage. So Teresa is very passionate and sensitive, and she does struggle with his infidelities, but she also has her own insecurities. She has a terrible relationship with her mother. She's got things around her body. She has these crazy dreams, but she's also very understanding. You never really have like big confrontations when she finds out that Tomáš is cheating on her. She's not melodramatic, truly. She just sort of internalizes everything. And I think he pulls her a bit more into like lightness. I think the dog helps her find lightness. We're not going to talk about the dog in this. Just be prepared to be very sad. I do love the dog. If you've ever had to put your beloved pet down of old age, the scenes at the end are going to break you. But I think they're very honest and raw and real. And they're some of my favorite scenes. They're beautifully written. So Teresa is a woman with like a lot of issues. But I think that Tomasz helps ground her and release her from some of those. It's really interesting to watch their relationship grow, especially as they move from living in Prague to Geneva, back to Prague, and then ultimately to the countryside. They have quite an arc, the two of them as a couple. And then Sabina is probably one of my favorite characters in literature. She's just so freaking cool. I want to be Sabina. I want to have that freedom and attachlessness. And she's such like a I don't know, not maybe not a role model, but she is like something that I wish I could embody more of. So she is one of Tomasz's his long-term lovers. She is an artist. She does these like abstract art pieces. She's beautifully portrayed in the movie. And she very much embodies like the full principle of lightness. She doesn't want to be tied down by anything. She just follows her heart. She follows what she wants to do. She abandons things. She betrays people. She has no problem actively protecting her own freedom. And I respect that in a lot of ways. I mean, she's not the best character. I don't know. Franz kind of sucks. So I don't feel so bad about his betrayal, but she's a very interesting character. She's very sexy. She's very intriguing. It's definitely sometimes you want to be able to cast everything off and just live life to on your own terms with literally no ties to reality. And Sabina kind of embodies that. And then there's Franz, who's this professor that she meets in Geneva, she being Sabina, and becomes her lover. And he's a very serious, very idealistic person. They butt heads a lot. I feel like it's such a weird pairing because he's this big idealist and he's like got all these ideas of what they should have done in Prague. And she's like, dude, you weren't even there. Like, I was there. Do you even understand how this works? Franz has his own life. He goes off with his idealist world and he gets swept up by his idealism and ends up meeting a not so great end. And his ex-wife is an absolute terrible person. Anyway, but I guess if your husband was cheating on you the whole time, that is an appropriate response. But the way that she commemorates Franz's life is quite mean. Anyway, so we follow those four characters. So after the invasion, the Soviet invasion in 68, everybody's lives change. Everything shifts. First, Tomasz and Teresa, well, first Sabina leaves for Switzerland. Tomasz and Teresa leave for Switzerland. Sabina meets Franz and starts to get those strings that she doesn't really want in her life, and then eventually cuts them again and moves again. Tomasz comes back to Prague and tries to be a surgeon again, but he wrote a piece of anti-communist literature before the Soviet Spring, not Soviet Spring, before the Prague Spring, before the Soviet invasion. That is now coming up, and they're trying to make him sign some affidavit that says that he didn't really mean any of it, or somebody manipulated his words, something, but he refuses to change or bend his ideals just to suit the government. I think that is a very strong moment in Tomasz's character, is that he's not going to compromise himself for the government, which I think is great. I love that moment for him. But eventually, Tomasz and Teresa, they leave the city and move to the countryside, and they find some sort of peace, some sort of regularity of existence. Meanwhile, Sabina is just constantly moving and trying to avoid any bonds. She goes from Geneva to Paris to America, and she keeps that lightness, that avoidance of human connection. She also has a deep sense of loss. At the end of the day, she loses three people she loves very dearly. She is our character left standing. And we have to remember that what does it all sort of matter even at the end of this story? Does it matter? Four people make decisions, their lives play out, and that's sort of the end of the story. There is no going back and changing anything. There is no recurrence. It is just life exists and we respond to different catalysts and make the best choices that we can. And that's kind of the story. I know it seems strange, but that's the unbearable lightness of being. I'm just going to take us back to sort of that first section. So we're on page 8, and Kundera says, we can never know what to want because living only one life, we can neither compare it to our previous lives nor perfect it in our lives to come. So our characters make a bunch of choices, we watch them play out, and it all circles back to this idea of there is no reoccurrence. We only live once. Sort of do the best you can, and maybe don't be so bogged down by the weight of that human agency, that existence, that ability to have free will and choice, or at least that's how I see it. For me, this is a very emotional book. I think there's a lot that you're going to it's a book that you're going to want to annotate, okay? Like you're going to want to note things. I read this predominantly on my Kindle this last time, so I have a lot of Kindle highlights. I have dog ears and underlinings in this edition, and I think this is my original edition. It was hard. When I was breaking up with an ex, we both had copies, and we both kept our copies, and we both had annotations in them. And this I believe is my actual copy. We probably should have, when we got together, we should have put our names in the books. That's what we should do next time. There's not gonna be a next time. But I really love this book. I think that this book is something that you're going to find a lot of humanity in. I think there's going to be a lot of self-reflection that goes on. And there is this element of uh, politics and world history and understanding that particular moment in time. I mean, Prague was having this really free, fun, swinging 60s kind of existence before the Soviet invasion, and then how that just clamps down and stifles people. You can see that in here, but it's not like about that, but it also isn't not about that. I mean, all of these things, all these events, all these choices, they are a part of our lives, and we're sort of inescapable in many ways. And I just love reading this and how much it makes me think. So if you want a thinky book, if you want a book that's going to make you reflect on your life, your decisions, the characters' decisions, and their lives, um, all in this context of does it all really even matter at the end of the day? Because you can't go back and change anything. Just do the best that you can. I think you need to read this book. Anyway, did I gush enough about this? I think I did. I have one more Kundera on my shelves. It's called Life is Elsewhere, which I need to get to one day. So if you've read that, please let me know. If you enjoyed this review, please let me know down in the comments. If there's anything you want to add to this that I missed or maybe didn't speak well on, please feel free to expand on it in the comments. I fully admit that talking about such a philosophical book is a little bit out of my wheelhouse, so I'm a little uncomfortable doing so, but I really love this book, and I've loved it across several decades now, and I want to have something here on the channel that sort of commemorates that love of this book and how important it is to me as a reader, and I think it's important to many of you as readers as well. It's a very popular book for a reason. And one of the videos I'm linking down below is a phenomenal review of this and the philosophy in this, but it's also a really interesting look at Kundera as an author and as a person, and maybe how he's a very unreliable narrator in this. And so there's a lot of interesting food for thought in some of the reviews I'm linking down below. So please check those out as well. Subscribe to those channels, give them a shout out, etc., etc. Anyway, I think I've rambled enough on this review. So thank you guys for watching. Please be kind in the comments. I don't know why I'm so self-conscious about this review, but I am. But anyway, like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in my next video, whatever it may be, because it's my channel and I can do whatever I want. Bye.